What are your Pokemon hot takes and pet peeves? This is a question that I asked fairly recently over on my Twitter and Threads accounts, and I got some pretty interesting responses. So in this video, I decided to gather some of those responses and basically discuss and share them with you all here in a video, because I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. And with that being said, let's just go ahead and get right into it. My hot take is that people gas up Unova to have the greatest story when, in my opinion, it's still pretty flawed and not that high of a bar to set for the best Pokemon story. Now, first things first, I want to say that I'm going to agree with some of these opinions. I won't agree as much with others, but overall, it's nothing personal one way or another. I'm going to respect all the opinions. Hopefully, you guys will as well. And at the end of the day, this is just for the purpose of fun and discussion. So, no hard feelings. It's not personal one way or the other. With that said, though, I actually can generally agree with this take that Unova's story is, at the very least, a little bit overrated. It's basically one of the first things people talk about when they talk about how much they love Unova or why Black and White are so good. And while I also agree that Black and White are awesome, personally for me, the story isn't the first thing I think of when I think about how good Unova is. I will say that it is one of the better Pokemon stories out there, but for me, it's not only not the best Pokemon story, at this point, it's not even the second best story, because I would say my top three are probably Unova at number 3, so Black and White, Black and White 2, you can lump all of them in there. They're at number 3. Sun and Moon, the original, not the Ultra games, are at number 2, and then Scarlet and Violet, personally for me, have the best story in Pokemon. So, lately, they've actually been, and those are all obviously from fairly recent generations, 5, 7, and now 9, so Pokemon have been sort of upping the ante just ever so slightly over the years with their stories, and so Unova, to me, hasn't quite held up compared to some of the more recent stories that they've done. So in general, I can kind of agree with this. I guess a pet peeve is when people judge you for not vibing with the bipedal starter Pokemon direction most starters have gone into after Gen 4. Now, this one is really interesting because I also got this response on the exact same post. Humanoid Pokemon have been a staple of the franchise since the beginning, so complaining about them now is asinine. Pokemon are monsters. Now, obviously, there are two sides to this whole humanoid Pokemon debate, and it in general has been a very touchy subject for basically ever. And indeed, with starter Pokemon in particular, a lot of the newer ones have been going in that bipedal humanoid direction, with ones like Incineroar, and you've got Inteleon, you got Quaquaval, you got Meowscarada. There's a lot of them in the past couple of generations. Personally, I feel like there can be a happy medium where it's okay if Pokemon are humanoid, it's just about how they do it. I think that just genre of Pokemon in general is a very fine line, and for the Pokemon to be good, it has to walk that line basically perfectly. For instance, a humanoid Pokemon that I personally really like is something like Lucario, or I would put Machamp in that group, or Gallade. Those Pokemon, to me, are an example of how a humanoid Pokemon can work. They look a little more unique, they still look beastly, they still look monstrous, and they don't have too much of a human vibe to the point where it gets, I guess you could say, creepy or weird. However, I would also have to say that I do agree with what the first post is saying here, and that I also am not really a fan of the more humanoid starters that they've been putting out in recent generations. And in this context, it's actually kind of funny because it's something that the second post here says that is the reason as to why I feel this way. Big shout out goes to my guy Dark and Windy for this one, but in this post he says that Pokemon are monsters. And for me personally, and I feel like I've seen this sort of mentioned elsewhere as well, that is exactly why I personally want my starter Pokemon to not be humanoid, because I do want them to be more monstrous. I mean, these games are called Pokemon, which is short for pocket monsters, so there is an inclination and a preference there by default to want to work and use and play with more monstrous designs and creatures. And when you get stuff like Inteleon or Incineroar, which you could say by definition are monsters, but with the uncanny resemblance that they have to literal people, it kinda starts to veer off of that line that I mentioned earlier and fall into a really weird, creepy, uncomfortable abyss. At least to me personally, but I think that's how a lot of other people feel as well. Basically, it's just a really slippery slope. You can definitely have humanoid Pokemon that are awesome, but they have to pull it off perfectly to be able to do so, and when they don't, it basically 100% of the time results in something disastrous. And that, in my opinion, is why I agree with the first post of this discussion, and I am not really a fan either of the bipedal starter Pokemon of more recent generations, because they haven't towed that line well enough and have fallen into that creepy, weird, uncomfortable abyss. Alright, now I've got something really cool for you guys. I wanted to pop in really quick and let you know that you can now order these special promo packs from my upcoming Histrobi Chronicles TCG. This is basically a card game that I'm working on with all my Fakemon designs, and previously you could only get these packs as a pre-order bonus if you got my Narwhal plush, but now you can grab them and order them all on their own. Each pack has 5 cards and includes one of 3 special alt art promos featuring Shrubberoos, Embit, and Narwhal from my Pokemon Cardinal series, and these special versions of these cards will not be made available anywhere else. The packs are honestly super nice, they're super fun to open, the cards are super fun to collect, and are a great preview of what's to come for the full release of the TCG. You can order yours at my merch store with the link in the description, and every order greatly supports the channel and helps to make all of this possible. So be sure to give that a look and start working on your collection today. I know it's a coincidence, but Pokemon hasn't been good since it went 3D. I don't hate Gen 6 and 7 as much as some, likely due to playing competitive, but if you break down the aspects of a game, story, mechanics, design, etc., most of them peaked in Gens 3 through 5. Mega's the exception. Now, this is not exactly a new opinion. This kind of sentiment has been out there pretty much since the games went to 3D, and the general idea is that the Pokemon games have generally fallen off since that transition was made, and that the older 2D games are just superior to the newer 3D games. However, I personally would have to disagree with that idea, because I think the 3D games hold just as much merit as the older 2D ones. While there are definitely things that the newer 3D games can improve upon and refine and all of that stuff, I also feel like at the same time that they are under a much bigger microscope, if you will, than the older 2D games were. And that's basically just the result of the world we live in now with social media and the internet and technology, and basically just being able to follow this stuff so intently and closely and being able to talk about it with other people. I feel like that has put a much more critical eye on Pokemon as a series, and a lot of other series as well, that has resulted in much harsher judgment compared to what the older games might have gotten if they were released during this time frame. And while the older 2D games are definitely awesome, they're beloved, and all of that good stuff, they're also not perfect either. Like, for instance, if you look at Gen 1, it is a buggy, unbalanced mess. If you look at Gen 2, a lot of people like to say that Johto's unfinished, that Kanto carries that game, that it is also completely unbalanced. If you look at Gen 4, people like to say it's incredibly slow, the Pokedex is terrible. Like, there are things, and arguably just as many things about the older 2D games that people like to complain about as there are with the 3D games. I just feel like, again, with the bigger microscope that modern day gaming has on it, and that modern Pokemon has on it in particular, I feel like there's just more of a critical eye on that kind of stuff versus the older stuff that we also look on a lot more fondly and nostalgically because it was from our childhood and things like that. The animations are truly what makes a Pokemon design stand out, not just the static image. It's why a normally good design like Articuno can feel a bit boring now since it just stands there, flapping its wings, and it gives more basic designs like Iron Bundle personality. This one I wanted to bring up because it kind of connects back to that 2D era versus 3D era argument that we just had, because a big part of that argument is that the 2D sprites of Pokemon look way better than the 3D models. A lot of times you'll see people comparing the 2D sprite of a Pokemon versus its 3D model, and they'll say something like, the 2D sprite looks way more expressive and exciting and all that stuff versus the 3D model that just stands there. Therefore, the 2D era is awesome and the 3D era sucks. This is another thing that I also disagree with because it does not take into consideration the literal medium of 3D versus 2D. Like, for instance, if you tried to take a 2D sprite of a Pokemon and replicate it just as it is with all of its excited expressions and pose and everything else into a 3D model and have that be the 3D model for that Pokemon in the 3D games, it would genuinely look terrible. And the reason why is because a Pokemon could not maintain the excited, interesting pose that it has in 2D in 3D, because there's a lot more things to consider. We're working with 3D space, so we don't have as many limitations that we had in 2D that we now have in 3D. We now have the ability to create constant animations, and basically a 3D model is much more of a living, breathing thing than a 2D sprite is, which most of the time were static images until we got to Generation 5 and they finally were given the ability to have animations. So I feel like it's unrealistic to expect a 3D model of a Pokemon to be doing all this crazy, actiony, super cool pose type of stuff in a 3D space where everything by default is more lifelike, and therefore it's more unrealistic for Pokemon and characters and just creatures in general to be doing those types of things. Like, would you really expect if you were in a Pokemon battle for a Pokemon to have all of these crazy movements and poses 100% of the time? No, that would be unrealistic. Most of the time, they're just going to be chilling like you see the 3D models doing until their trainer gives them a move to use, at which point they will then do some kind of move or attack or animation or something like that. So it just is way more fitting of the medium, and the stuff you see in the 2D games where the sprites are striking all of these crazy, cool looking poses, it just wouldn't work the same. It works great for 2D because that is what works in the 2D medium, but it just wouldn't translate to 3D because there's so many more things to consider. Yes, you can give the 3D models more animations and things like that, but in general, I don't feel like that is a fair comparison to make. And getting back to this original post, it's another point in favor of the 3D era because the 3D era allows more of these animations to take place, which does bring a lot of life and personality to some of these Pokemon designs that otherwise wouldn't have it if you're just looking at the design itself in terms of its official art. So this one I would have to say that I generally agree with, but now we are going to move on to the next hot take. I really don't want voice acting in Pokemon games. I like giving the characters my own voices. This, especially at this point in time, I would say is a very hot take, and unfortunately, it's not one that I can agree with. While I do feel like there is some merit to limiting voice acting in a game, and in this case Pokemon games, for reasons such as this post says, to allow the player to kind of impose their own imagination a little bit onto the world and immerse themselves a little bit more, so it's not as much like you're watching a movie or something like that. With that being said, there is still a lot of value to having voice acting in the games as well, and I think recent Pokemon games have shown certain moments at the very least where voice acting is absolutely needed, and it's a detriment to the game that it's not there. For example, I can vividly remember playing Pokemon Sword and Shield for the first time, getting to Spikemouth, going to battle Piers, and then there's that whole cutscene sequence where he's playing a concert, except without voice acting, it's just super awkwardly silent, to the point where it was like almost cringy how silent it was when you were expecting to hear a lot of noise and music and also vocals, because in the game he's singing, but you're just not hearing anything because the voice acting isn't there. So as Pokemon goes on and we start getting more and more of these modern, sophisticated games with better graphics and all that kind of stuff, we're gonna get more moments like that. Except without voice acting, it just means that we're gonna get more and more moments in the games that feel cringy and awkward and just are uncomfortable to watch. So voice acting, in my opinion, is an absolute necessity, and I mean a necessity within the next couple of games or so. However, I am totally open to them doing limited voice acting, like just for cutscenes or something like that, so they can maintain a sense of, I guess, the silent protagonist vibes that they've kept up to this point and kind of the classic feel of the original games. I'm all for that, but there definitely is going to be an absolute need for voice acting in future Pokemon games as things kind of advance, because that just comes with the territory of more sophisticated 3D experiences. Infernape is one of the most boring looking starters in the series, and by far the worst Sinnoh starter design wise. This one is a pretty hot take, which is ironic because Infernape is a fire Pokemon, but honestly, to a degree, I would actually have to agree with this. I won't agree in the sense that I think Infernape is like a bad Pokemon or anything like that, but I have always felt that Infernape is a bit overhyped. Like, I personally, and it's just my opinion, but I've always thought that Infernape was like an average starter Pokemon at best, and was kind of like, I guess, shocked over the years to see how many people just absolutely loved Infernape. And I also know that the anime has a lot to do with that too, because Infernape was pretty important in the anime, had a big role there. But just in terms of design, I never was super impressed by Chimchar, Monferno, or Infernape at all. In fact, I can kind of remember as a kid seeing Chimchar for the first time and sort of like feeling like really? Like, this is the best they could do for a fire starter? It's just a monkey with the fire type slapped onto it. And that was like, as a kid, I was feeling that. And I was like a Pokemon fan, so I wasn't one of those people that's just like, oh, Pokemon isn't cool or whatever. Like, I was always a Pokemon fan, never really went away from it that much, and even then I was kind of feeling like not really impressed with these Pokemon. And then in terms of like comparison to the other two, I definitely feel like the Infernape line is easily the weakest. Empoleon is absolutely amazing, one of my favorite Pokemon of all time. You can't ever go wrong with Piplup. Turtwig obviously is amazing as well, and Torterra is a great Pokemon that, even if it's not people's favorites, I feel like everyone pretty much agrees that Torterra is really cool. So while I don't hate Infernape, while I do think it is a good Pokemon, I would have to agree with the sentiment of this post that Infernape is the least good of the three and is a bit overrated in my opinion as well. Pokemon catching in Let's Go was so much more fun and better. No RNG, and it actually requires a bit of skill. This is another one that I definitely agree with as well. I have mentioned this in past videos, but I really feel like Let's Go gets a lot of flack that it really shouldn't, and in one of those areas is with its catching mechanic. While RNG is still involved in the catching of a Pokemon once you actually hit it with the Pokeball, I personally feel like the act of actually throwing a Pokeball to catch the Pokemon, or at least attempt to, is so much more exciting, immersive, and just has a lot more of a gameplay type of factor to it than the regular games where it's simply pushing a button and hoping for the best. Yeah, I don't necessarily think it should be a staple for every Pokemon game going forward, because I don't necessarily want motion controls in every single Pokemon game that I play till the end of time, but as a single individual mechanic in this single individual game, I thought it brought a lot to the table that, like I said, I think was more immersive, was more exciting, it just got you more invested in the act of catching a Pokemon versus simply just pressing that button like we usually do. And with Pokemon like Legendaries, where you also had a higher difficulty factor, and then there was also you had to beat them in a certain amount of time before you actually even got the chance to catch them, it also made catching Legendaries legitimately hard instead of just throwing 50 Ultra Balls at them and then eventually catching it, because it's just like you're just playing the odds at that point. Like there was way more, it just felt way more challenging and satisfying to be able to catch a Pokemon and a rare Pokemon like that versus the regular experience. So this is another one that I absolutely agree with 100%. The series never needed to be open world, and it suffered for it. Scarlet and Violet has probably the most boring and stagnant region design as a result. This one is another very, very spicy take, but unfortunately, it is one that I cannot agree with at all. Pokemon definitely needed to go open world, and it has not suffered for it at all. In fact, it's benefited and will only continue to benefit as it continues to put out more games with open world gameplay. While I don't necessarily think that every single game that comes out in the future needs to be open world, and I definitely think there's value in the more linear Pokemon experience that we saw in the earlier first few generations that sort of established the Pokemon formula, the open world kind of gameplay concept is a perfect fit for Pokemon, and it's basically what Pokemon was made to be in general, where you're a kid and there's this huge region full of creatures, and you go out on this adventure, and your goal is to literally explore the region and catch every creature that is in it. That general idea lends itself so perfectly to open world, and it's what people wanted for so long before open world games were even really a thing, because it's honestly, I believe, at its core, what Pokemon truly is in like the truest sense of what Pokemon is as a series. So open world and Pokemon are a match made in heaven as far as I'm concerned. The other thing is that with Scarlet and Violet being the very first true open world game that Pokemon has ever done, it's only going to get better as we go along, because obviously doing an open world game is a big task. Making that jump from non-open world to open world is a really big deal, and so Scarlet and Violet is pretty much the baseline, and it's only going to get more refined and better as we go along in terms of that open world experience. So we're only going to get a richer, more fully realized idea of, again, what I believe is like what Pokemon truly is, and that is an extremely exciting prospect that is going to only bring Pokemon to higher and higher heights and set the standard for what's possible for the series. In fact, I would say that if Pokemon never went open world, that is actually where Pokemon would start to suffer, because it would be resting on its laurels, it would not be moving upward, and would just be trying to coast and cash in on the same formula that has worked over and over and over again forever. And while you don't necessarily want to fix what ain't broke, eventually when all of these other games are kind of pushing forward, pushing ahead, ascending to higher heights, they're implementing open world stuff themselves, they're doing things that Pokemon could do, but then Pokemon is kind of just, again, coasting and just relying on outdated mechanics and different things like that when it could be sort of leveling up and growing and evolving, that, in my opinion, is where it would really suffer. So while I don't think open world needs to be the absolute way that Pokemon makes every single one of its games going forward, it definitely is the new standard. It should be the new standard, and it is the way that Pokemon needs to go, because that is the path for Pokemon to be able to grow and ascend to higher heights, basically, and keep up with the gaming landscape as it continues to grow and evolve as well. I personally also feel like Paldea, with it being designed around the open world concept, is a perfectly solid region in terms of what it has to offer. It also, for what it's worth, has the single greatest area, in my opinion, of any Pokemon region ever, which is Area 0, and that's not necessarily to do with it being an open world region, but in terms of the region in general, as this post makes mention of, I would have to say that I don't necessarily agree with the idea that it's stagnant or boring, because it literally has what I believe to be the single coolest area that a Pokemon region has ever introduced. So I feel like the region itself is perfectly fine as well. And those were some of your Pokemon hot takes and pet peeves. If you'd like to add to the discussion of any of these hot takes, be sure to let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. And if I happen to share one of your opinions in this video and discussed it, no hard feelings whatsoever whether I agreed or disagreed. It's all just for the sake of discussion and fun, and everyone has the right to their own opinion. So no hard feelings whatsoever. Also, if you did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, because it really helps out. And if you would like to submit stuff like this for potential future videos and possibly even a part 2 to this video, be sure to check me out on Twitter or Threads, because that is where I will do that kind of stuff if I ever do something like this again. With that being said though, thanks so much for watching, I really appreciate it. I'll be back with another new video very soon as well, and until then, as always, thanks again for watching, and I will smell you guys later.